Have you ever been home alone and felt like you're being watched? You're probably just being paranoid, right? Too many horror films. Or maybe you have a sixth sense. What about that time you experienced that strange feeling of someone staring at you and turned around only to find out it was true? If someone was secretly watching you right now, could you feel it? Scopisthesia, or the psychic staring effect, is the idea that we can feel when we're being watched through a sixth sense that helped keep our ancestors alive. Rather than using sight or sound, we detected nearby predators via an extrasensory perception. In 1898, psychologist Edward Titchener shared a much more rational explanation to the phenomenon. He said that those moments you sense a stare and turn around to see someone looking at you, you'll likely remember. But if you suspect something, turn around and see nothing, you'll probably forget about that quite quickly. And also, by turning round, your movement might attract the attention of someone behind you, and so the two of you might catch each other's eyes. But let's take that out of the equation. What if there was no physical way of knowing you were being watched? What if you were under secret surveillance? Well, in 1990, author Rupert Sheldrake carried out a bunch of these experiments. In one of them, he gathered 40 subjects to do normal, everyday activities like eating and watching TV. 35 out of the 40 people said they had no idea they were being secretly watched. The rest of his experiments showed similar negative results. So if science isn't really on our side, then how do we explain that feeling we all seem to get of being scrutinized by unseen presences? Maybe not so much by people, but by people no longer with us. Many have claimed to have seen the spirit well, but have failed to prove it through methods that are scientifically sound. Yet even with no objective, conclusive evidence proving their existence, believers continue to believe. But maybe it isn't so much about the evidence. The concept alone does seem enticing. We live on with unfinished business or whatever. We get to speak to our loved ones again, even if they don't ever really speak back. But this is how strong belief is. In times of crisis, people see and hear what they believe as a means of comfort. Grief was the spark to spiritualism in the 1860s, and the Fox sisters were the kindling. They lived in a little house in Hydesville, New York. At a young age, Kate and Maggie would play tricks on their parents and older sister, convincing them that the house was haunted. In their bedrooms, they tied apples to strings, bumping them against the floor in the night. As time went on, their tricks only got more convincing. The ghost began making tapping sounds while the girls stood seemingly motionless in the same room. This scared their family and intrigued neighbours who came to see it for themselves. They quite quickly became famous in New York for their public seances, and it wasn't before too long that hundreds of others would claim to be able to communicate with the dead. After the American Civil War, mediums would profit from the thousands of grieving widows hoping to speak to their husbands and sons who'd been killed in battle, and thus began the spiritualist movement. Interestingly, the Fox sisters did eventually own up to the fraud. They admitted to faking the unexplained tapping sounds by cracking bone joints in their toes and knees, but it was too late to stop the believers. Imagine single-handedly creating a new religion, a religion that began in your own home from seemingly harmless pranks, now amassing millions of followers. So really, spiritualism is nothing more than just a hoax we've tricked ourselves into falling for, a combination of both illusion and our open willingness to suspend disbelief. That's it, right? But I've heard stories, genuine stories of people who've said they've spoken to their dead nan with Ouija boards or seen faces of shadow people in doorways. How can so many people share such similar paranormal experiences? Surely it's more than just one big prank. If you're particularly suggestible, try this trick at home. Get a pendulum or a ring with some string and hold it in front of you with your arms still. Now, slowly begin imagining the weight swinging back and forth. Keep focused and just wait for the movement to start. Don't force it to happen. It might take a while, but slowly it should swing on its own. When that happens, mentally tell it to swing even more. Then, tell it to swing in circles. It's a really bizarre feeling. It feels like it's moving on its own. But as any rational observer would say, it's obviously nothing paranormal. It's your body moving it subconsciously, right? But why does it feel so real? Why is it not so obvious to the subject? When somebody uses a Ouija board, assuming they aren't just mucking about and pretending, and they focus hard enough, willing it to move, tiny micromuscular movements in their fingers will probably push it without them even realising. When they see it heading to a certain letter, other players will come to a sort of consensus of where to move it next. Everybody's aware of these movements, but they're unaware it's them who's making them. So maybe it isn't anything supernatural, but rather simply your body acting out the mind's impulses through subtle unconscious movement. Psychologists call this the ideomotor response. It's similar to when you see someone scratching their chin on TV and subconsciously do the same thing. You probably know someone who scoffs at ideas of the supernatural, but when it comes to the Ouija board, refuses to touch it. Granted, we will never know the exact cause of anything. Maybe there really is a demonic underworld just brooding to be awakened. But when it comes to finding answers, finding truth, it's important we remember Occam's razor. When faced with the choice between explanations, choose the one that requires the least amount of assumptions. So we know the body can play tricks, but what about our perception? Assuming we aren't taking any psychedelic drugs, can we still see things that aren't really there? Well, in 2010, a researcher, Giovanni Caputo, conducted an interesting experiment. He got 50 people to look at themselves in a mirror for 10 minutes in a dimly lit room. Afterwards, he asked them about their experience. All 50 people, 100% of them claimed to experience some form of dissociative identity effect. 2/3 of them said they saw their faces morph and change shape. A quarter of them said they saw faces of their loved ones and people they've never met before. 50% of them said they saw monsters. Imagination had altered their perception. Their eyes were still taking the image as usual, but were then received by the brain, which was lacking in any stimulation. From staring at one single continuous point for long enough, the brain began chasing for new information. Neurons stopped reacting, and the brain started filling gaps in their visual field by blending with the surrounding scenery. This is called the TROXLER effect. If you want to spook yourself out, you should definitely try it. It's a great example of how our minds affect our perception, and could even explain why we sometimes see faces we pass off as ghosts. It's the perfect explanation to why Bloody Mary can be so creepy. Like Bloody Mary, the Charlie Charlie challenge captured the eyes of youth culture as an easy way of speaking to the dead. The internet was flooded with videos of kids screaming at pencils and pretending not to blow on them. And everybody knew that it was all just pretend. But nobody cared, because it wasn't really about ghosts or the supernatural. It wasn't designed to be taken seriously or analysed as proof of the spirit world. It was about bonding and having fun with friends, the same way we dedicate the Halloween season to celebrating fear. Have you ever been in a scuffle with somebody in the street or brushed with a speeding car, and afterwards felt a weird rush of confidence, almost as if you kind of enjoyed it? The chemicals our brains release during the fight or flight response, like endorphins, dopamine and adrenaline, are a big part of why fear can feel great. Everybody processes fear differently, but those who find enjoyment in life-threatening situations probably watch a lot of horror films. When we walk out of the cinema after seeing a terrifying film, we often feel satisfied with ourselves, relieved that we overcame something scary and wasn't physically harmed. Roller coasters give us that same kind of thrill. Fearful situations often bring friendships and relationships closer together. If you met up with a blind date and you shared a scary experience with them, you'd probably feel more attached or even more attracted to them than if you just met them in a usual setting. And it would probably make for a pretty memorable story too. The world would be a very messy place if it wasn't for stories. You probably don't realise how much time you spend telling them. Stories are gossip you pass on at work. They're the awkward, half-remembered memories you call your most embarrassing moments. Stories are parables we tell our kids to prepare them for life. They're biographies of footballers' wives and films that take us back to certain eras in time. Stories bring meaning and entertainment to our lives. They can make us feel happy, uplifted, deflated, exhilarated, shocked, disturbed, scared. And there's nothing more engaging than a great ghost story. So we have a lot to thank for the uncertain paranormal world. Its centuries of bringing us weird and creepy tales around the campfire has and will continue to captivate us all.